Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Cooper. I'm the Head of Business Development and Marketing at Knosco, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our panelist discussion, which we focused around the emerging cloud security trends in an ever-changing landscape. Thank you for joining us. I'm joined by three talented IT and security executives. I'll let them introduce themselves. John, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is John Barrett. I work for Pool Reinsurance, who are a terrorism reinsurance company, the only one allowed by government mandate. I've got over 20 years in the industry. I've worked my way from desktop support to projects, rollouts, infrastructure work, migration and transformation work, consultancy, eventually ending up in cyber, where I've been for the last 3 years or so. I've worked various sectors, print media, education, management consultancy, software house, and finally insurance, where again I've been for the last 3 years or so. That's me.
Lovely. Thank you, John. Good morning to you. Ilias, over to you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ilias Papakostadinu. I'm the Director of Professional Services here at Knosco. I have worked in the industry for about 15 years, and for the last 10 of them, I've been working for managed services providers. Knosco is my fourth MSP. I've been with them for more than 6 years. I here have the privilege to lead a team of cloud migration experts. And me, myself, I'm a big cloud advocate. I have an extensive knowledge and experience in cloud migrations and also modern workplace transformations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilias. And finally, over to you, Hilton.
Right, thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. My name is Hilton Stewart, and I'm the Head of Security here at Knosco. I've been with Knosco now for almost 7 years and heading up the security division for just over 3 of those years. My background over the last 20-odd years has been in the technical aspects of IT across various industry verticals, retail, education, manufacturing, and managed service providers. Moving on from the technical aspects into initially governance, risk and compliance, and more recently on to include defensive cybersecurity. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you, Hilton. Obviously, 3 fairly knowledgeable gentlemen here this morning to answer your questions. So please pop your questions in the Q&A and the chat box, and we'll look to address them as we go through. As we know, as we've gone through this year, cloud computing has provided a real capability for organizations to improve their agility and stand up their capabilities to pivot with the changing demands of the workplace over the last 12 months or so. But that's not a new change that we've seen here at Knosco, and we've been working with our clients over a long period of time now to look at cloud. And that obviously brings around a number of inherent challenges itself. And we appreciate that security obviously remains a top concern to us and also to our clients as well. So we'll be looking to have a discussion in a number of trending areas today. Just to quote a couple of stats, according to a cloud security report this year, 75 of the surveyed respondents stated that they were very concerned or extremely concerned about the security of public cloud. I'd like to know, as we go through this, whether or not these are areas of concerns for you, and please highlight those questions to our panelists. Again, thank you for those as well who have prepared questions ahead of time for us. We did put a survey out on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, and we're really grateful to everybody who had sent through questions for our panelists. We picked out 3 initial ones. We've also got some included into the panel discussion as we go through. But the first of the pre-questions from the audience was for Ilias. And this one is around what are the differences between cloud security and on-premise?
Excellent. I think the most important differentiation when we think on-prem vs cloud security is the concept of the shared responsibility model. Now, when we think on-prem, we're solely responsible of our infrastructure, the reliability, the security, and everything that comes with that. Now, when we talk cloud, we are thinking about shared responsibility. The cloud provider is responsible for the data center, physical security, hardware security, again, reliability, availability, and then, of course, the patching and all the services that they provide, anything as platform as a service or software as a service, are solely reliable to make sure that they are secure and available. Now, on the customer side, when we work in the cloud, we are responsible for the operating system of the virtual machines. We need to make sure that we patch them. We're responsible, of course, for the configuration of the networking and the firewall. And lastly, of our data. In the cloud, the data is our responsibility, but everything else lies with the cloud provider. Now, when we think, again, cloud vs on-prem, we think about the cost. When we're talking on-prem, security has a large upfront CapEx and of course has an ongoing operating investment. Except from the hardware and the software, you also need an expert team to be there to monitor your infrastructure. Going from the cloud side, you usually pay for what you use. You may be able to take advantage of security features and technologies that usually a medium-sized business or a small business will not be able to afford at all. And of course, because the cloud provider is managing a lot of that, you need a smaller IT team. Lastly, talking about compliance, most of the cloud providers are already compliant with most of the major frameworks. And you also get tools that you can report and monitor your compliance status. Versus doing that on-prem, you have to do everything yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilias, for your in-detailed response there. Much appreciated. John, we had a question specific actually to the insurance sector. What security challenges does the insurance sector face at the moment?
I don't think as a potential victim of cyber we are a unique industry by any stretch of the imagination. I think that we face quite a lot of challenges that are common to all, particularly the prevalence of configuration issues as being the most likely route of exposure. Certainly, rate of change is also something in the various cloud platforms. It can be very difficult to keep abreast of. Users of Microsoft and AWS alike will probably attest to the fact that it's a constantly moving picture and sometimes a challenge to find an admin panel or console where you last left it. Again, speaking to scale, this is something that one of the people that I was speaking to prep up for this meeting said that where you've got DevOps as a prevalent MO, do the C-suite really know where their estate is? It's so easy for admins to spin up virtual machines, to leave them running. It's a constant battle to keep on top of where your infrastructure is. I was reading something about an insurer recently that were subject to ransomware, and they said that they needed to disable over 200 admin accounts, which to my mind was no small part of the problem. If you've got 200 admin accounts, that's a big exposure. But the insurance-specific angle that I think I probably would stress is that we're not just victims of cyber, we also insure against it. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of clarifying the T's and C's. I think that customers probably need to be a lot more alive to the fact that they need to write specific clauses in to boilerplate policies. It's worth noting, again, I was doing a little research, it's worth noting that, we're 5 years on from NotPetya, and yet Chubb, Allianz, and others are still fighting claims because they've asserted that it was actually a nation state action, and it was a warlike action which indemnifies quite a lot of coverage. So I think that there's a bit of a hearts and minds battle there in terms of cyber insurance being fit for purpose and better understood by those selling it. So I think that those are the only insurance specific points to note. As I say, endemic to all, but yeah, we're also purveyors of cover against, and that's something that I think is evolving.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, John, for your answer there. The final question before we get into the actual panel discussion itself is for Hilton. What are the top trending security threats in the cloud?
Thanks, Mike. So it's an interesting question that whenever it comes to trending with security, because I think, as John alluded to, it's such a fast-paced and fast-moving environment, and the move to the cloud is only exacerbating that speed. So anything that involves trends or historical data does tend to be a little bit skewed. But I think some of the important ones that we're starting to see, especially from this year, and we'll look to see in the future, is increase in remote working has led to a much greater exposure of sensitive data. But potentially more importantly, the move to the cloud, which is what has also led or driven remote working, has led to quite a greatly reduced visibility into infrastructure and attacks and breaches, which is combined as it basically meant that a lot of businesses are not able to see attacks when they happen or in time. And also, as Elias alluded to earlier, the move to the cloud brings with it different risks and vulnerabilities than traditional on-premise infrastructure. And that's something that I think a lot of companies are still only getting to grips with post-cloud migrations. It's not always something that's planned for in advance, which can be a bit problematic. We're also seeing that cloud data centers are increasingly becoming targets for cybercrime, things like ransomware attacks, because they represent a very, very attractive target for cyber criminals. If you can breach a data center, you effectively have a buffet to choose from when it comes to victims, if you will. And also the increased use of the cloud is driving increases in security budgets to protect data and deal with more complex attacks at the moment. And also related partly to that speed is that compliance and regulations are slower to adapt to the different requirements of the cloud. So that leaves a lot of organizations without guidance, leading to find their own way to protect data without sort of relatively well-known frameworks. And lastly, an increased need for security and process automation just to deal with the increased volume of alerts and repetitive attacks is another big trend that we're seeing at the moment.
That probably leads us quite nicely actually into our first discussion topic actually around cybercrime. Obviously, it's probably one of the more well-known things around security that will drive activities within the business. I think what we like to draw out today's discussion is around what the impact is around those increased levels of cybercrime. I know that from some of my research beforehand, 2020 certainly seen a significant increase in the number of ransomware attacks that we're seeing. I was reading a Microsoft Digital Defense report, which actually showed that 13 billion malicious and suspicious emails were sent in the last 12 months. 1 billion of those actually had URLs that were set up specifically for phishing. So this is on the increase, and I've been in the industry for 10 years, and security was not at the forefront of everybody's mind, but it seems to be a hot topic of conversation at the moment. I'm going to go to you, Hilton, just to start off with. What are you currently seeing within the CSD division around cybercrime and the trends in that area?
So I think cybercrime is increasing in general, both in complexity as well as in the speed of attacks, which is probably not surprising. Cybercrime has been on the increase for years, and I think will continue to do so, although its rate of change is going to increase. Strangely, some areas are actually showing a slight decrease compared to previous years, but if anything, this is really just indicating that malicious attackers and methods used for cybercrime are continually evolving, often faster than most of the companies that are able to defend against it. Obviously, the move to remote working has provided an opportunity for criminals to target remote workers with increased phishing campaigns. I mean, statistically, a phishing campaign or a spam email is more than 90% likely to be the initial point of contact for any attack, whether it be a credential breach or ransomware for profit or anything like that. Attackers are also starting to utilize the cloud in new and increasingly complex ways to launch attacks, making use of the existing technologies that consumers and organizations are. And also increased commoditization of attack methods such as ransomware as a service and even phishing campaigns as a service is an increasing trend in cybercrime that we're seeing quite a lot more of. As this evolves, we're likely to see a wider spread of common attack types such as phishing and ransomware, which was going to create a lot more noise for security teams to deal with and potentially mean that the more advanced attacks are not detected in time. The more sort of sophisticated attacks, sorry, Ines?
No, sorry, I think Hilton, from what you're saying, that I do see from us and our customers that making sure that we educate and we train users is probably one of the most important things, because most of the attacks that you're talking about, really they start from the users and their ability to identify a threat or not.
Yeah, user awareness training is one of the fundamental first points of defense really against any sort of attack. Having said that, the more sophisticated attacks are most likely to remain the domain of the arguably more experienced and focused attackers. However, these attacks are by nature of the technology, especially move to the cloud and their speed, are becoming harder to identify and stop in time, mainly due to that increased sophistication and speed.
Interesting. One of the things that tends to come up in quite a lot of conversations that I have actually with clients is that, you just don't know what you don't know when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to security, and how do the attendees on the call, the clients that we speak to, how do they actually mitigate that cybercrime and really try and prevent it? Obviously, user training is one of those areas. Is there anything else that they need to be considering?
I think visibility is really a core component as well, exactly as you say, Mike. If you're not aware of something or you don't have visibility into an area, how are you going to know when or if there is an attack going on or a potential issue? So methods to keep visibility of estates as they evolve from the central sort of on-premise and more into the cloud infrastructure is a really important component to mitigate against that. And also either security teams internally, which is not really something that a lot of SMEs and smaller companies are able to fund, or having an outsourced security team that's able to respond with experience to what alerts are identified and generated is key, I think, to mitigating these attacks. You're never, unfortunately, going to be able to stop attacks 100% of the time. That's just not ever going to be possible. It's about preparation and identification in time to make sure that where there is a successful attack, the implications are limited, and also the time that the attackers have in your network or in your infrastructure is as limited as possible.
And I think, Hilton, you're touching something very interesting here. We all used to have our support teams, making sure that if anything breaks, we fix it, but we are not used to having dedicated security engineers being able to identify the logs, analyze them, and do something about. And that's something that more and more companies need to realize, that you can have all the alerts in the world, but if you don't have someone expert to be able to do something about it, then you're still on risk.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think by the time those logs get analysed, it's usually as a post-mortem rather than a preventative measure, unfortunately.
That's very true. And I think this is why, John, we also need automated ways of responding to this kind of risk. So having the systems that can automatically do something about, take an action, and then probably have a security expert to then go and analyze what happened there.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Sorry,
that sort of AI response, if you will. I know that's a buzzword in the industry at the moment, but really things like process automation, as well as you allude to, Elias, and whatever machine learning capabilities and newer solutions do come up with, are a vital evolution of defense at this point. Be able to respond quicker to those alerts. The thing to keep an eye out for, obviously, is the proposed silver bullet, where some AI solution is going to protect you 100% of the time, which again, as we've mentioned, is just not really a realistic solution.
I think the other point to note is that it's called cybercrime for a reason. You also need to look at the flip side of the coin in terms of the detection rates, a static legislation compared to the rate of change of attack vectors, and also the frankly kind of almost just a nod to a white collar crime in terms of the penalties for being caught out. I think the legislation is something that we're going to come on to later, and how difficult that is. But yeah, you need to be contravening a law for it to be a crime, rather than just basically shaking someone down for ransomware payoffs. But I think that the flip side is often ignored. We can often get into the sort of technical discussions of attack vectors and log analysis and whatever, but there needs to be a better conviction rate, a better detection rate by law enforcement as well.
That's an interesting point. We don't need to leave that discussion to the end. We can have it now, and that's the whole point of this panel discussion, is so we can explore different areas. And it's an interesting point that you raised, John. And the first thought that comes to my mind actually is, how do you report a cybercrime offence? Is it traditional models? Is there a different way of doing it? What happens if my data's in a data center out in Europe somewhere? Now that we're obviously going through the whole Brexit scenario, how does that, how do we deal with that situation?
I sincerely hope you're not expecting answers from me on that discussion point.
And that's probably the problem, John, is
Yeah.
the fact that we don't know.
And at the moment, to me, it looks a little bit more like maritime law in terms of, you know, you might have a ship or a company owned somewhere, or registered with a flag of convenience somewhere else. You know, where do the jurisdictional boundaries lie in that? It's often impenetrable, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of the problem with cybercrime is attributions, is who is actually to blame for the attack. You know, trying to prove that point is incredibly difficult generally, certainly at things like the nation state level even, but for normal organizations that don't have huge resources behind them, it's often just not viable to figure out who was it that actually attacked me. Rather, let's just mitigate it, get over it, and make sure it doesn't happen again. But even if you can point to an organization, an individual, an entity, as Mark says, who do you normally report that to? Because most countries' police forces, to a certain extent, are not really set up to deal with cyber crime because it's not tangible, it's not local, and we see it even with things like GDPR when it first came out. There's a great lack of historic case law to know how is a judgment going to go either way. And that's still the case with a lot of data protection and cyber laws. They take a very long time to catch up, and they catch up by experience. But obviously, in order for there to be experience, something bad has to have happened already. And it's what you do in those situations.
I think we need to be careful. The horse kind of feels like it's already bolting. We're talking about increases in cybercrime, but the governments around the world haven't really yet caught up. And when I was doing some reading around this over the last couple of weeks, it's been, you know, very much FBI, Interpol kind of leading the investigation charge, and not really many other people. You know, which obviously creates a vacuum when that crime does happen. And you know, we're here to talk about the impact of these things on you know, on business, on, you know, on our organizations, and and actually we really can't, you know, we're dealing with it on our own, really. I suppose
that's effectively the upshot, because I was going to allude to, is that it's in the absence of proper legislation or effective legislations, most businesses are left to deal with it by themselves. Not only the fallout, and I think, John, as you alluded to, not only even when there is insurance involved or some form of mitigation like that, often without a lot of historical case precedents, it's not a quick process. You might be covered for cyber insurance, but chances are, if something happens, it's going to be potentially years, not weeks or months, until you see a payout, which is, for many small businesses, often too long. You know, it's once it's happened, you're stuck with the implications in the short to medium term. Can your business survive that?
Yeah, and overwhelmingly, the answer is no. The percentage of businesses that fail within 12 months of a cyber attack is, I don't have that figure to hand, but it's massively disproportionate. Most firms about it.
Okay, I'm just going to go to a question that we brought in on the cyber law area. Actually, is there anything that organisations can consider implementing, such as any frameworks and best practices, to mitigate the fact that cyber laws are very much in their infancy?
I think, again, it comes down to businesses looking after themselves first, as a not necessarily a prevention, but a mitigation strategy. There are frameworks out there that encourage good cyber hygiene. You know, Cyber Essentials is a very good place to start for a lot of organizations, both as a mitigation, but more so as an awareness or sort of eye-opening exercise, make sure good cyber hygiene is in place. Now, the likes of the ISO 27001 for information governance provide a good internal framework for companies to get a handle on their information security, data protection. But I think that the key there is organizations should look inward and implement their own industry recognized frameworks, international frameworks, as opposed to looking for external support. And by that, I mean they should be implementing things like Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001, as opposed to waiting for government to mandate those various frameworks.
I think it's interesting to note where successful prosecutions are occurring. The analogy I'd use, it's almost like getting Al Capone for tax evasion. Where you get successful prosecutions, it tends to be business to business. And the example I'm thinking of is Facebook, owners of WhatsApp, successfully charging an Israeli cyber outfit for breaching the terms and conditions of using WhatsApp. So it's very much still baby steps, and perhaps not even that, in terms of use of traditional copyright breach and breaching of terms and conditions rather than cybercrime ordinance that's being brought to bear successfully.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, John. I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to move into a slightly different area, because the trend that we're seeing around increase in cybercrime impacting the cyber laws as well, that's been fundamentally driven by a changing trend around the use of multi-cloud and cloud solutions as well. I just want to talk a bit about what we're particularly seeing, specifically more so around multi-cloud. And Ilyas, I'll open up with you on this one. What are the things that you're seeing at the moment?
I mean, there's two main trends that we are seeing at the moment. And number one is the need for businesses to use multi-cloud solutions. So especially larger organizations, they do not just need one public cloud solution, but they need to choose between different ones and pick and choose the correct solution, especially something like DevOps, John, that you referred before. Each one of these public cloud providers will give you different tools, and different dev teams may want to take advantage of that. So this gives a lot of complexity on how do we make sure that we centrally manage, monitor, and we authenticate against all of this. And really, this is the word, centralization. This is what businesses need to try to achieve. And of course, it's complex because we are talking about multiple different cloud solutions, can be even software as a service, that somehow we need to be able to integrate with monitoring, with security, and being able to pretty much maintain. So one of the strategies is to try and have a common networking and security framework that can seamlessly go across all different platforms. Now, again, this can happen, but it's challenging because of the different features that each platform may give you. Now, a big buzzword at the moment, but also an important one, is zero trust security. And when you really hear zero trust security, what does that really mean? I think it's the concept of continuously validating security, configuration, and posture, and really being able to grant and being able to grant and keeping access to applications and data. So what does that really mean? We need to be able to authenticate each time before to try to access data or a service. And how do we achieve that? We achieve that, of course, with multi-factor authentication, with single sign-on, with identity and access management, especially on the cloud. This is very, very important. But also, we need to be looking at next generation endpoint security. So how can we have something such as a conditional access for people that don't know what that means? How can we make sure that our endpoint and our workstation has all the appropriate updates on the OS, has the correct antivirus, and also at the same time, how can we also make sure that if John's account is trying to access cloud resources from Africa right now, how do we make sure that the system can very quickly block that, because this is impossible travel? So the last thing that we're trying to suggest for our customers to have is security and monitoring tools, a SIEM solution that can take all the logs from 10 different platforms and just move it in one, so the security teams can have one interface that can very quickly monitor, analyze, and see the threats.
And that, I think, as you say, Elias, alludes right back to visibility. The more you now have, first you have the complexity of moving on-prem to a cloud infrastructure. You lose some visibility, you lose some control. Now you move on-prem to multiple cloud environments with different workloads and different SaaS solutions or different cloud providers. And how do you get visibility, or the same visibility, across all of those, and the same ability to act in time? And I think it is a very different approach to security than on-prem used to be. And it does bring with it quite a lot of different risks. And one of the other things, of course, that the prevalence of cloud and multi-cloud brings with it now is the ease of use of cloud solutions, which results in a lot of shadow IT. If you've got, departments or users within your organization that need to do something, and generally security is perceived to be the guys that are telling people that they can't do stuff. It used to be a case of you had an internal argument or a discussion, but you could be the gatekeepers to that access. Now, with the cloud, if I as a user within an organization don't like the policy that says I can't get to my files or whatever, I just go and run up my own Gmail or Google Drive or my own OneDrive or something outside of the organization, start sharing files without visibility. You stand no chance of protecting that sensitive data.
And I think that's a very good point there. And one of the things that I've seen with our clients is that people can see security sometimes as someone that stopped them from doing their work. And I think what is very important is, how do we educate the users on why do we need to have these measures? And from the other side, how can businesses effectively prioritize risk? So how do we make sure that we block things that they really matter? And we're not just going, we put just a blanket there that stops everyone from, from really doing their job.
I can see John smiling in the corner there.
Yeah,
some experience there, John.
It's something that I sometimes refer to as Dr. No syndrome. Being the cyber guy, you're always the guy saying no, no, no. That has a very limited cachet within the business. I mean, obviously, the most secure system is one that no one accesses at all. You do need to compromise, but I'm aware that I only get so many no's per month, and inevitably you do end up compromising, because otherwise you are seen as wholly obstructive. And I believe that Hilton's absolutely on the money when he says that you can't afford to be that all the time. You need to be cooperative with the business, much as you're sometimes seen as someone who is wholly obstructive. It's a difficult line to walk.
Yeah, Hilton's got the same reputation in Knosco as well. Just got to know.
Used to it by now, it's fine.
The one thing that stands out in my mind here, and I see there's a question actually that's come up around data. Obviously, multi-cloud means data's in lots of different places. Shadow IT means that data's in even more different places that you didn't even know about. How do you maintain data integrity and also ensure, obviously, that organizations are DPA and GDPR compliant?
Well, I think first of all, you need to have a very good idea of your infrastructure. Shadow IT is by itself a challenge for organizations. So you need to have tools to be able to identify that. So I know that a strong bring your own device policy and how you use tech in a business is important. But then from there, you do need some kind of monitoring capability. You need to be able to monitor the network. You need to be able to through web filtering, looking what your people are accessing. And that sometimes people may think that this is a privacy concern, but organizations need to have ways to see where the data are going, else the risk can be a lot higher.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, Ilias. Sorry, Hilton.
Just agreeing with Ilias on that one.
Yeah, there's also a challenge as well, especially with cloud, of having all data in one place and end up with, lakes and pools of data as well, which can become quite complex to manage as well, and really do anything with it. But that's a completely separate topic, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point, Ilias. I suppose for one of the questions that came in beforehand was around actually managing complexity around cloud architectures. Are there any kind of specific advice that we can give our attendees here on the meeting of what they can do to kind of prevent things from escalating and spiraling and becoming out of control?
From my own opinion is that people should really take the time to choose the appropriate tools, because something is a new trend doesn't mean that we allow our people to just go and just download this tool. There needs to be a very specific way to choose technology in the organization. And I think that's the main problem right now, especially if you hear creative teams or developers. You see all these new cool tools in the internet and you just want to be part of that. You want to try them. But unfortunately, this creates a lot of chaos on the background, especially when we see examples of clients having a lot of different locations around the world, and each location using completely different storage and cloud solution. that creates, of course, it's a very expensive infrastructure to maintain, monitor, and secure. Doesn't enable collaboration, doesn't enable a lot of things. So it's very easy to download something and start using it these days, but there needs to be a reason behind that.
Thank you, Elias. John Hilton, anything to add to that?
I think it's very, very easy to get an overly complex architecture these days, especially in the cloud, exactly as Elias says, with so many different solutions. And I think it's very important for businesses when it comes to reviewing their technical architectures to take a leaf out of the sort of information security auditing type framework, which is along the lines of the ISOs and stuff, is make sure that you've built some sort of semi-regular annual review at a high level, at least, into what is your architecture at the moment. Have you got an idea of what it is, how it's grown in the last 12 months, and potentially the bits that you no longer need that are just sitting there ticking over? Maybe only one or two specific users still need them, or they're not even used at all. Make sure that you've got a view of that infrastructure and how you can continuously try and simplify it without introducing extra risks. Because at the end of the day, complexity in any area is going to bring you extra risk. There's just no doubt about that.
Thank you, Hilton. John, anything to add?
Yeah, I think the human element plays quite a big part in terms of exposure. I think the DevOps deal, as I mentioned earlier, people able to spin up entire virtual estates. I'm not saying on a whim, but for test and dev, and then you go to version 1.2 of the product, you can get all about the estate of version 1.1. So I think that where human factors are at play, then the answer is usually in process. Application of, standardization of, and as Hilton says, regular review, audit type activities, possibly even without having auditors actually there running the audit. That should be an internal function.
I think there's certainly, sorry, John, didn't mean to talk over you there. I think there's a maturity, really, isn't there, that, that organizations and businesses can really look to kind of move through. I know our next subject is a bit further far out there. I've worked around machine learning and AI for a long time, and it's obviously coming up fast on the horizon. A lot of organizations in security are talking about it, what it really actually means. And for me, sometimes it evokes thoughts around smoke and mirrors. What are we really doing with machine learning and AI? Is it really AI, or is it just an algorithm? And I think sometimes we can get drawn into that. I think though what we want to focus on here is how the rise of AI and machine learning is really impacting security, and how do we actually mitigate those attacks using tools within our kit bag, people within our businesses. John, I know when we were briefing beforehand, you've got some interesting thoughts around rate of attrition and skills that are needed to support that. But I'm just going to open it up really to you guys as a panel about what are the trends that we're seeing around AI being used specifically in security.
So, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think AI, and to a lesser extent machine learning, I think is a buzzword at the moment. It's very popular in the industry. Many solutions are claiming to implement some form of AI or machine learning into their products, which is great. It's certainly the way that things are going and things are going to need to go. The human element is just not capable of dealing with the volume at a low level of alerts and doing that intelligent correlation for repetitive tasks. Something that robotic process automation and machine learning are very good at doing. Once you have a use case in place or a process, you can then turn that aspect over to a type of AI or machine learning to deal with and to alert and mitigate those common use cases. But that's always going to leave you, I think, those fringe cases where you are dealing with not a normal attack or not a normal incident, where AI is just not going to be capable of dealing with it to an acceptable level that a human could. It's marrying those two together in an effective way at this point that's really going to make a difference. I think in the future you've got to use some form of AI or machine learning for the speed of response, but there still needs to be, and always will need to be, the human element in that.
It's the other kind of AI, isn't it? It's actual intelligence.
Yeah, exactly.
Hilton, I have a question that I usually get from a lot of our customers, which is, so we definitely recommend some use of AI when it comes to protecting your estate. And they quite often are concerned about false positives. So pretty much AI stopping people from doing genuine things. So what is your opinion around that?
So that is, it's an element, it's a risk. It's something you're always going to have whenever you implement any form of semi-automated or automated response. It really does come down to having the skill set around to be able to tune that, which is why deploying something like a SIEM solution or an AI type solution is almost never just a case of unbox, implement, and you're done. There's going to need to be tuning to pick up those use cases where it is blocking a legitimate case, and it's a balance. It's much like email filtering and all of those sort of things that actually have an impact on users. At what point is the organization comfortable to sit of risk versus ease of use? It harks back to the standard security saying is that, well, with security versus ease of use, you can have one or the other. You can't have them both at the sort of 100% level. It's all again about that human element of being able to look at the system that is doing or performing actions, knowing what is actually a true positive and not just what the system thinks is a true positive versus a false positive, and being able to tune accordingly is an element that you're going to have to have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking in the chat window. Actually, I've got a couple of questions that have come in. Can you detect attacks before they happen?
It is possible.
If you could.
It's it all depends on what is the type of attack. It comes back to the conversation, I suppose, around things like 0 days, which are things that have never been seen before. Those are possible with AI to detect in terms of pattern recognition, for example. Is this an anomalous behavior that doesn't sit within what the organization normally does? So there are solutions that are quite good at doing that, and they are able to stop attacks that are undetected but are doing things that are not normal within an organization. So more sort of symptomatic as opposed to the actual attack itself. But this is one of the bigger challenges in security, is speed to detection. And it's why one of the biggest issues is that dwell time or time to detect attacks is often measured in months. When attackers have access to infrastructures and organizations, it's happened already. The attack, in inverted commas, has already happened. They have access to your infrastructure and your systems. They just haven't done anything with it yet. Normally, you only get those detected when there is an action. So it's about also mitigating those negative consequences when they happen, as opposed to always aiming to stop the attack before it happens, because that is a very fine line between usability. Again, the more you're trying to stop attacks before they happen, the more you're going to impact user experience.
And I think, Hilton, one of the things that I struggled when we started with security many years ago was the fact that security is a layered approach. You don't just have one awesome AI solution that's just going to cover all your needs. You need a lot of layers. Same with your house. You have multiple doors before you enter the house. And that's something that we recommend. Hopefully one of these solutions will see something different and block it.
I think there's also a point to be made in terms of there's a differentiation between prediction, as Hilton said on the call earlier. 90% of attacks are going to start with a phishing email. So that is where you align quite a lot of your capabilities. But it's also, the question presupposes that an attack is a thing. Within the industry, we talk more about attack chains. And for example, a ransomware is more than likely going to be accessing some sort of public encryption site, perhaps that hasn't been accessed before over the network. You're then more than likely going to see a spike in hard drive activity on a particular affected machine. So identification of the chain and the likely steps necessary to perform a ransomware attack certainly is possible, but Hilton and Elias, I'm sure, would agree that has to be almost entirely, again, AI and machine learning seem to be C-level clickbait to an extent and used as synonyms for each other. It's not, but you can clearly identify, the steps necessary to perform a desired outcome. But the speed of response has to be at machine level, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Thank you, gents. We're coming to the end of our time on the webinar. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, a couple in the chat window, and we've got one in the Q&A. I'm going to go to one in the Q&A panel, and this might be one for you and I, Hilton. How does Knosco, as an MSP/MSSP for various customers, approach the subject of improving visibility within the customer environment without it looking like we're trying to sell additional security services?
It's an interesting one, that, and I think a very challenging one to answer at the end of the day, because there are many things within security that you just can't do without the right tools, as Elias alluded to earlier on. In order to get that visibility, you need a solution. You need some configuration. I think at the end of the day, it's really about understanding the client's business objectives and their risk appetite to start with, as we always try and approach security very much as a holistic sort of solution to a client. It's a combination, as Elias mentioned, of layers, but more importantly, it's got to start from business objective and risk appetite side of things, rather. You've got to understand the business, where they're going, what they're trying to achieve, and what risk they're prepared to accept before you can even start talking about this latest technical solution or that latest technical solution. Which is also why we normally recommend that organizations have at least some form of framework, even if it's not an official externally certified framework, at least some elements of a policy-based framework or risk-based framework, because all technical sort of controls for security should generally be driven from the business level first. I think it's a top-down approach. And it's about conversation, really. It's a partnership with clients. It's not about coming in with, this is our bag of tricks and how many can we offload on you, which is going to be the silver bullet, because that's never going to work. It's not going to get utilized by the business.
And it's certainly a change in approach that we've brought actually to how we do, we manage our accounts with our customers. Taking a technical account management approach just allows us to get a little bit closer technically to understand the needs of our clients, rather than trying to sell the next latest and greatest thing that comes down the line. And John, from your perspective, having from a client side, how would you answer that question?
I was going to try and jump in there and say that as the non-Knosco person on the call, if I didn't jump in, I'd be doing you guys a disservice. I think that I have seen fairly aggressive upselling from certain of our vendors. Not Knosco, I would add. I think that one of the areas that Knosco struck us as a company as being particularly successful in is willingness to adopt our existing tooling and work within it. The acumen that they bring really was what we were engaging with and purchasing, if you like. But actually, compared to what some of the costs of some of the product suites are, that's quite a modest part of the whole in terms of your cyber expenditure. It's always difficult because cyber is an area where your success is measured by the non-event, and return on investment is extremely difficult to prove. Therefore, but I think that there are certain business models that are appealing. I think that Pocket Scene particularly is something that's worth looking at. It's something that tries to avoid proprietary lock-in, and therefore, as a customer in this equation, it makes you much more sort of vendor portable. So that if you're investing a lot in offensive playbooks, for example, you can take those with you between products. But I don't think that Knosco necessarily upsell aggressively. I think that the skills and the acumen are really what they bring to bear. And as I say, as a part of the whole cyber expenditure, that's quite modest. You may argue that means that you need to choose that much more carefully as a result.
Thank you, John, for your input on that. It's much appreciated. Hopefully that answers the question, and your response actually brings us quite nicely into one other question we've got here. I will offer anybody still on the call the opportunity to ask some other questions. We might have time for one more, but this question is around the growth areas of cybersecurity. What do we anticipate to be the next biggest growth area in the cybersecurity space?
I think IoT is a huge one at the moment. More and more now you see connected devices everywhere, from your house to anywhere in the business to your car. So it's interesting. I was seeing this documentary at some point, which is pretty much there is a business in Israel right now that their job is how do you protect cars from being hijacked remotely, because you have your Teslas and all of that stuff. And right now, if you're a highly valuable target, they can just hack your car. And that's pretty much that's it. Kill you if they want, stop the brakes from working. So IoT, I think, is a huge area right now.
That's a very interesting one, actually. And I always think, actually, back to protecting my car to a program back in the early 90s, Tomorrow's World, in South Africa, and had flamethrowers going out the side. hopefully we won't have to worry about anything like that. But IoT certainly, it is more points of penetration for attack. For me, that's probably the biggest thing for me when I think about it. I've been in telecoms for quite some time. Is how do we protect against that? How do we make sure we've got resiliency to protect against those attacks? And how do we mitigate against that? Is there any other trends though that we're expecting to see, or growth areas to start?
I think as much as it's something that's been around for a little while and is being hammered on quite a lot by the industry, but this machine learning and AI aspects is something that I think we're going to see incorporated into a much broader base of solutions. I mean, we're already starting to see it featuring in endpoint detection and response, so EDR solutions, as well as the sort of anomaly detection type SIEM solutions. Those are areas where we're going to start seeing greater drives to handle that lower level initial point of contact, just to be able to filter out all the noise that is inevitably going to increase. So I think that sort of visibility and response capability is an area we're going to start seeing increasing, hopefully, quite a lot in products on the market, and less of this is a single solution that's going to solve all your woes type approach to the security marketing at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you, Hilton. So that brings us to 5 minutes to the hour. I'd like to close the webinar there. I'd like to thank everybody who's taken their time to come and join us for this discussion. Hopefully you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you, John, for joining us, Hilton and Ilyas, for bringing your expertise to the call. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.